Hey folks, it's Sharon Blanchard. Welcome to Who's That Leader in the Mirror? For over 30 years, I have dabbled in the leadership field that culminated in a search for the perfect leadership philosophy. But as I like to say, I'm still growing up and I have so much to learn. So partly because I live in a remote area of the world, I've decided to make this podcast a shared classroom where we'll take a deep dive into leadership. How being authentic doesn't necessarily mean you're a better leader. We'll have conversations around identity, ego, and humility, about being courageous and value-centered leadership. We'll chat with leaders who understand that who they are, their identity, their sense of self, values, and beliefs are integral to their leadership approach. They're leaders who want to make changes in their approach to become a better version of themselves and realize that they need to reconcile who they are with what they do and how that's golden. It's the golden key to living their leadership approach authentically. I have cast a wide net of friends and colleagues, those I have worked with and have a tremendous amount of awe and respect for. Today we are joined by Leader in the Mirror, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch. I am completely humbled and honored to have Barb join in on our conversation. She's an absolutely brilliant lady and someone I dearly feel proud to know, to love, and ascribe to be like. So who is Barb? Dr. Hamilton-Hinch is the Associate Vice President of Equity and Inclusion and an Associate Professor in the School of Health and Human Performance at Dalhousie University. Her work examines the impact of structural, systemic, and institutional racism on diverse populations, particularly people of African descent. Barb is from the historical African Nova Scotian communities of Beechville and Cherrybrook and the mother of 3 beautiful boys. Welcome, Barb. I'm so excited to have you join the podcast, joined by one of my oldest, dearest friends, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, and I'm so humbled that I can now call you Dr. Barb Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
So
likewise, it's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. It's fantastic. Likewise, I was so excited when you also became Dr. Sharon Blanchard, but I do miss you here in Nova Scotia.
Yes, we're getting all grown up, aren't we?
Indeed, with more responsibilities.
I know, right? Well, especially you. Tell us. So let's dive right in. Just so excited to talk to you. Barb, for those who are listening, is someone that I have been absolutely, I don't even know how to put it into words, humbled to have as a friend, as a guide. You're my spirit guide. You're my cultural guide. You've been an incredible force for me, I think, back in the days when we both worked at the university, right. And someone who just kept me grounded. And yeah, so before I get too much into it, tell us a little about who you are and what you're doing these days.
Sure. Well, I work at Dalhousie University. Still haven't left. I'm actually celebrating my 20 years at Dalhousie in terms of as a full-time employee. But my current position is the Assistant Vice Provost of Equity and Inclusion, and I'm still an Associate Professor in the School of Health and Human Performance. So research keeps me busy, and administration keeps me busy, and teaching. But I really enjoy being at Dalhousie. I was there as a student a couple of times, both as my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD. So I think I still have a lot to give to Dalhousie. And so I'm really enjoying my time in these 2 positions.
Wow. And how blessed is Dalhousie to have you in such an important role? And when you think of I'll pronounce it wrong, but the integrality, is that a word?
We'll make it a word tonight.
Yeah, it's a word now. Tonight for you, today for me, right? New Zealand?
That's right.
Yeah, but it just how absolutely critical, right? Your role to every facet, right? If you can imagine, every cell of the university, right? Every living.
What I really like about the position is that one of my responsibilities is to develop pan-university committees. And so we have a strategic plan that's in place. I'm also one of the pillar leads in our strategic plan. But when I speak of the pan-university committees, Dalhousie's been doing reports, since the 80s around equity and inclusion. And there's been lots of reports. And some of those reports, the recommendations haven't been implemented. So my job right now is to help implement some of those recommendations. And I'm doing that through 6 pan-university committees. And so those committees have faculty, staff, students from across the institution, including our Truro campus, which is always important not to miss. So having fun, being in the sandbox, and really trying to make a difference and an impact at the same time.
Yeah. It's funny. Back in the day when I was still working in leadership positions within Nova Scotia universities in Canada, we started really using that sandbox term, right? What does it mean these days? Like, right? What's it actually mean?
Well, I think for me, because we often use it when we're developing courses on Brightspace as well. You get the sandbox to practice and make sure you know what you're doing. For me, I like the idea of the sandbox because you bring in different ideas, different people, different, I guess, ways of doing things. And so mixing that all up within the sandbox and coming up with hopefully some action. And then if it doesn't go well, you just erase it and start again. Like the sandbox analogy really helps me to think about that nothing is permanent. And that as we grow through any of the leadership positions that we're doing, any of the changes that we're trying to make, sometimes change comes from making mistakes. And it's okay to make mistakes. And I think some folks aren't comfortable in making mistakes, but sometimes that's where you do your greatest learning. So the sandbox also gets you to remember that we don't know as much as we think we know. So it's just like having that eraser on the end of the pencil. It's there for a reason.
It's so true because we have a culture of, it's that kind of old traditional style of hammer down leadership, right? If you make a mistake, you're in big trouble. I actually went through a bit of PTSD leaving the university's environment because you couldn't make mistakes. And you and I have been through so many incredible journeys together. You think back in when we were doing the recruitment campaigns and some of the scarily
some of the slogans. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
It's important to talk about that. Like we help save mistakes. And some mistakes can be huge.
Right.
And so that's why the team has to be so diverse and come from different perspectives, because if you're looking at it from one lens, you may not realize some of the mistakes that you're making or that you could make. That could be astronomical. And I use that word because that would have been an astronomical
That would have been. Are we allowed to talk about that yet? Because that was so huge.
We can.
I call it kind of in a secret because I think of, the board approved the unexpected intellectual, right?
Right. And the unexpected intellectual is going to go on top of a black male that had on a white t-shirt, undershirt.
It was
a white beater shirt.
Yes. Oh my God.
That's what they call them. Yes. And so I didn't refer to it as that.
I know. It's so horrible.
Right. I know. And that was the image they were going to put up. And
you
so those would be.
Yeah. Right. Little Sharon, right. On campus, little like communications manager calling her friend to say, this doesn't feel right. I need you. Right. I'm right.
And sometimes we need to listen to that belly, right? That intuition that comes in our gut, the conscience that sits on our shoulder. And I try not to dismiss that. They're there for a reason, right? That little, that doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right.
Right. It's so true. It's hard to be that person though, you know who I am and my background. And I always feel like that little poor kid, right? From inner city, downtown Toronto. And I always feel like that's where my belly gut intuition comes from. When something's wrong, it's wrong. But I always feel like I've been that fighter, that advocate, but it's hard to be that person.
Well, it can be tiring. And as you know, I mean, I identify as an African Nova Scotian, 8th generation African Nova Scotian. The first in my family to go and finish university. I had siblings that have started, but sadly, the first African Nova Scotian in the history of the university to graduate with a PhD. Yeah. And so,
amen.
When I say so when I say I carry weight on my shoulders, it's a lot of weight, especially when you think about some of the racism, discrimination, homophobia that still exists in Canada, in the world. So being very conscious at the institution and not taking a break. Because I truly am that person that will fight against any type of marginalization of any site. And even correcting people when they say marginalized communities, and I'll say communities that have been marginalized, because some of us don't see our communities as being marginalized. We've been marginalized because of colonization, because of racism, because of discrimination. So we also need to be careful how we refer to populations that are survivors, that are fighters, and embrace others who are also fighters who had different experiences of fighting against resistance, whatever that might have looked like.
Your journey as a student, Barb, you were the first Black student advisor on campus. Back in the days working with student services, you have been a leader from probably the moment you came out of your mother's womb, right? You were probably that big smile. And she's like, what am I going to do with this one? How do I handle her?
And I am the baby, right? So I credit my mother for a lot of my skills. I mean, my dad passed away when we were 14. So mom became that single mom of 5 children and taught us hard work, taught us the importance of giving back as well. And in any degree that I did, it was always with the intent of how can I help other people who look like me? How can I help other people who haven't had the same opportunities as I have had? And that advocacy is important, right? I don't have no apologies for being an activist, for being a disruptor. In order to make change, sometimes you need to do those things.
Yeah.
So I wear those titles proudly. And getting a Black student advisor on campus was me being a disruptor, because we needed a place for students to go where they saw themselves reflected, where they felt that they could find a sense of belonging, where they could share their stories with people who looked like and understood them. That was very important to have that on campus.
It's so true.
Yeah, but when things got tough, you had to find other folks on the campus that would fight with you, and you were one of them, right? So no one is an island. You need other folks to help support you and advocate with you. And that's really important when you're trying to make change, and having different folks. And I don't use the term ally lightly, right? Because as we know, that's been co-opted in so many different ways. And I want to be the one to call somebody my ally and mean it, that they're in the fight with me. People can't just walk around and say, I'm Barb's ally. If you're in the fight with me, then it's my permission to call you that name. And I can say that you are one of those allies on campus. Sharon, I could just knock on your door and say, girl, I need to sit down and chat.
Right?
What are we going to do about this?
I know, right? There were so many things too. I mean, those early days, right? And it's still, but I think for me, that's, that was my safe space as well, to just, and part of it is that authentic, to be who I am, right? And not one day goes by that I don't think of the privilege that I have just because of the color of my skin. But there's not one day that goes by where, for me, you need to have those safe spaces,
right.
But the ability to be authentic, right? And I've never really had that ability to just be who I am. I feel like I've always been trying to pretend to be someone else or fit into someone else's pigeonhole for me, right? And
well, even the conversations we had about spirituality, right? Like, people can't talk about spirituality and be afraid that we're pushing somebody else's practice on somebody. Whereas in actual fact, spirituality is what sometimes helps many of us to get through tough times. And it's okay to talk about spirituality, but these are things that aren't often looked upon to share. But that shapes me. It shapes me as a Christian leader at an institution. And that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge other religions. It means that I also celebrate who I am as a Christian, and that's okay. Right?
Imagine if you were to go into a meeting and say, can we start this meeting with prayer? Right?
And in some meetings we do.
And in some, right? Which in the kind of secular campus environment that we worked in, you couldn't even do that, right? And I remember even hiding the fact that I was going to mass at lunchtime, and it was like, right? And but then getting the confidence to be able to do that.
Right.
Absolutely. I think I was in, that's why I think I did my master's, because in spirituality, spirituality is a pedagogy, is an approach to that classroom, learning that classroom methodology and creating them in a safe environment. As I'm looking out at the mountains and feel the spiritual, it's just like, right, that's who we are.
Oh, I'm envious of whatever scenery you have. Right now it's dark, it's getting chilly, and there's not mountains that I'm looking at.
I will try to exude some of that awesome feeling in through our conversation. I'll rebound it back into you. But it's true. And and I think of, like, a lot of my research is authenticity. And I think it is that searching for that leader who you can trust, right? Who you can completely trust, but who, and I guess I'll even go further. Like, for me, my research is in principled leadership, because authentic leadership wasn't enough for me. It was, you can be honest and have integrity, but who are you? Who are you really, right? In terms of values, beliefs, but it brought in love. So principled leadership brings in love and spirituality. So it's in spirituality, in the sense of it's that knowledge of that I'm not the center of my life. Someone else is guiding me, helping me, supporting me. And I believe in God. And so even having to share that world view, my lens as a female Christian, right? And having the strength and the confidence to have that voice wasn't always easy. So I think that,
I was going to say, I think it is challenging to lead as your authentic self, but it's important, because I think if I'm not being authentic in the things that I do, then I'm cheating on myself, right? And so I've been in those positions where you wanted to make sure you were fitting a certain mold, or that you were responding a certain way or dressing a certain way. but that had to change because it just wasn't me. It was work just to be who I was trying to be, as opposed to who I am. And so I often will say to my students and into meetings that you get what you see. Like there's no surprises coming from me when I lead. There's no surprises when I come into a meeting. If there's something that I think isn't appropriate, if there's something that I think is discriminatory, if there's something that I'm not comfortable with, I will speak up. And I am so thankful that I've been able to be my authentic self in those spaces. And I think because people have come to expect that lens, they're not surprised when it comes. But at the same time, I have to be very careful that I'm not the only one that brings that lens, because then it can be misinterpreted as me always complaining about something, when in actual fact, it should be natural for people to begin to lead things with also, we call it a race conscious lens, particularly when we're talking about leadership and change. We need to recognize that there are differences in how we treat people, how we respond to people. And when we pretend to think, oh, I don't see color, that's a form of discrimination. That's a form of racism. Oh, I never noticed that you were a woman. And so those comments actually affect how we respond and how we react in certain spaces. So people need to be called out when they think they're being inclusive, but in actual fact, they're being exclusive.
I always remember when I worked for a university that didn't have an employment equity anything. And I was like, Barb Hamilton-Hinch has to come into this space. Right. And I always remember, you're at the front room and front of the room, and someone said, oh, where is she? And I said, oh, she's the short Black lady down at the front of the room. And when you began your talk, you were like, I love Sharon Blanchard, but she just discriminated against me. And everyone was like, what? Thinking, and it was, she was like, yeah, she called me short. Bloody hell, who the hell she is? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember that. And sometimes when I go into teaching spaces, particularly in some of my first year classes, because there's not very many people aren't used to seeing a professor of African descent at Dalhousie University. So I often just sit in the front of the class. Obviously, I can't do it now as I get older and wiser, and there's gray hair that's in my head. But I used to just sit in the class and just wait to see students' reactions when I stood up to say, okay, let's get started, and then introduce myself and just watch the look to each other. Like, that's our professor. So I think when you're coming from a leadership position as a racialized person and a racialized woman, you're very conscious of that when you're in front of a space, or when you're in a space or in a meeting.
What's going through your head?
You mean right now? Everything, right?
I think, that's like every time that happens and every time you do that, what are you thinking about?
I'm thinking how exhausting it is, as we talked about that previously, right? Like, why should people still be surprised in 2022 that you have women that are leaders and that you have women that are Black and leaders, or in positions of influence and power? And it would be great when we don't have to feel that when you walk into a space. And having to be, aware of how you articulate, how you dress. Like, some things I'm still conscious of that because I'm aware of the stereotypes that exist around people of African descent. So it can be exhausting. But as you do your hum and your thinking, your reflection, I have to think about on the shoulders that I stand on, right? So I have to think about my ancestors and what they went through and how I am because they were. And so their experience of equity, their experience of standing tall is very different than mine. So I stand tall because they allow me to stand tall. And so I can't, the word doesn't feel sore. I can't show up and not do well because of the history that I'm a part of. Right. So that's important for me in everything that I do, to reflect on my ancestors. And both my mom and my dad are both ancestors now. And so that sometimes is challenging for me when I advance in things and wish that they were there to see me, like, physically. And that sometimes is hard because you know that you're making an impact and a mark that they weren't able to make. But their sacrifices made it possible. And we bring all that with us, right? Like, you can't leave that at the door when you go to work.
No. And that's why identity is such a part of my own research, in the sense of knowing who I am and really understanding who I am. And sometimes it's trying to reconcile that. So for me, it's like, who am I in this moment? How do I reconcile that? Because when I was working in the university sector, I wasn't the best sense of self, I feel like, especially when I moved on from Dal and worked at another university. I kind of, I talk about Ottoman conformity, like who did I become? Fiscal gun at my head. And it wasn't kind of that ideal, Sharon. And how do I reconcile when I'm my best in my parish community volunteering, when I'm a coach in athletics and supporting people and helping and enabling, authentically caring and loving and leading from behind and guiding, right? And looking at, I remember, back in the day, looking at every student that came into my office, like you're someone's son, you're someone's grandson, you're someone's daughter, right? You're someone's wife, keeping that fresh, right? But who am I, and how do I really reconcile the best of who I want to be with who I am right now in this moment, right? And it's that looking in that mirror, so that I can clearly look at myself and sleep with a good conscience. And even when things go awry, how did I deal with that situation, right? Because things go to crap sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
They do, and even sometimes when that happens, because I know that I can be a responsive person when things go to, in the bucket.
Yeah.
And so I can react too quickly. And so because I recognize that I've been teaching myself to take a step back before I react.
Yeah.
So when I get an email that's like a really inappropriate email, which happened today, and I'm so quick to want to just respond, but I've been teaching myself not to respond right away because that's an emotional response to a bad email. And I have to stop and think about it and see where the teachings can be in that email for that person, because I also need to remember and meet people where they are to a degree. And that can be challenging, because I would like to think that everyone has a better sense of awareness of themselves. And especially when I think about an institution that's really trying to push equity, diversity, and inclusion. And you just hope that people came out the womb with that in their lens. That's their idea. Why not? Why aren't you thinking about diversity, inclusion, and equity? Aren't you? Everybody else is. And it's hard to not realize that not everyone is where you are. And so like you, I think of people as, how would I want to treat my children? And now both of my children are at university. One's getting ready to finish. So they're both at Dal. And so I'm very conscious in how people are treating them. And the hard part, and I don't know if you had this experience, is that you're not able to just be their mom at the university when you call somebody. And I know that we're not supposed to call for our children anyhow, but when anybody's interacting with me around my children, they're interacting with me as the assistant vice provost, equity and inclusion, or associate professor. And so I find that that's hard sometimes, that I can't take off my leadership hat in certain spaces when I want to, like even in the community, right? Like I remember doing some research and in my community, and people will say, well, we have to get permission. No, I forget what it was, but in my community is where my safe place is. But because I sometimes work at Dal, I become Dal. And so there's that yin and yang that you have to have when you're trying to also be yourself in your community. Like your job defines you in some places. So I need to make sure that, not that I separate it, but that I represent Dal well in my community well. There's always that, it's interconnected. It's hard to separate.
And the most important thing is that you are who you are in both of those scenarios.
Right.
That's the hard part. That's what I used to find hard. But I think it's getting a little bit better, but crazy, hey?
But what's getting better, right? Like one thing that I'm trying to work on is making sure we take time for ourselves, being reflective, both in our professional life, in our personal life, in our family life. And I don't think that many of us take enough time to be reflective, to think about ourselves, to be selfish, and making sure that word isn't even what's used when you're taking care of yourself. I sort of took a couple of days off, but while I've taken a couple of days off, things have happened. I'm like, well, maybe I should go back in. But in order to be our best self, you need to take care of yourself. And I'm trying to learn to do that. And I think that that's hard to do.
For me, when I worked in the university sector, I absolutely didn't take care of myself. And my priorities were probably, especially being young and trying to figure life out and professionally grow and raise a family and all of that kind of stuff. But I think I was just trying, I don't know, I think I conformed too much into the culture that I was working in, and didn't really, and even still, like, it's like you have that, what do they say? Like, what is it? Syndrome. Like, what is that thing they call, imposter syndrome? Sorry.
Oh, yes.
But like even doing this I'm like, who the heck am I? What do I know? Right. Who am I? And that's, especially in leadership, because leadership is still very capitalistically not inspired, but it's capitalism is still pushing what is the common conception about what leadership is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
is.
in an environment. And so that's, for me, it was like, let's just talk about what leadership really is. Like, what is leadership? And even though, I've been researching in the field for many, many years, and maybe that's that little kid within me, that little advocate. It's like, I don't want to talk to the people who are paid $1,000,000.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And get the support, and have always been, and either politically or, for whatever reasons, have always been supported in those leadership roles. So maybe I'm a little bit, I don't know, not generous toward those individuals, but do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many different trajectories to how people become leaders. And so for me, it's, for that road to authentic leadership, we see this in the university environment. I don't know if I'm making any sense all of a sudden, but, where you see faculty members being, appointed into a dean role, and everyone's going, what the hell, right? Like, how did that person, and their political appointments, or their, it's someone taking care of somebody else. And so for me, it's about, I just want to chat real leadership. Like, what is it? Right. And not in terms of the what's leadership versus management, but it's about, what really makes great leaders, right?
Yeah. But we see leaders being appointed in so many things, right? Yeah. In government, in politics.
Yeah.
And sometimes, to some degree, parts of that appointment is part of the old boys network in terms of that whole IOU, or when you get there. Yeah.
I was trying to
know that. Well, we know that sometimes that still plays out. And so I think it's challenging to still define what makes a good leader as well, because there's so many different attributes, there's so many different factors. And I think, like you, I try to be involved in first year students, whereas, as people become further up in their professoriate, they don't want the first year students. Right. And so for me, I like watching first year students grow. I like seeing their strengths. I like helping them to become leaders, or to see the leadership skills that they have that they didn't know they had. Right. So I love watching growth in students. And I think that's why, even though I'm in an administrative position, I still keep my faculty position, because that allows me to do the hands-on. Yeah. And to be there for someone who wasn't there for me. Yeah. And so at Dalhousie University, we can count 5 professors that are African Nova Scotian born at that institution. And that doesn't mean that I'm there to save every student, but I know how important representation is. Yeah. And so I know how important it is for students to see someone that could potentially be their supervisor at a master's or PhD. And a lot of my research looks at the impact of racism on the health and well-being of people of African descent, and also transfers into other diverse populations. So I've taken on that responsibility as a leader to make sure that research and programs are being developed to support populations that haven't been supported in the way they should have been supported or should be supported. And for me, that's not a surprise when people know that that's my portfolio. But it's also challenging if I want to change that portfolio, right? And so that also happens in leadership, that people don't always see all that you have to bring to the table. If you become an expert in an area, and that's how people see you, and if I were to move into another position, they may not value that skill in the same way. So now it's my turn to say, I don't know if I'm making sense. So sometimes being authentic, in one area can hurt us when we want to branch out in other areas.
And if you think, if you were to, like, literally, like, this can be my own, really, I'm just doing this so I can get my own mentoring and coaching in, right? But, if you think, like, to those folks like myself or anyone who may be listening, what advice would you give them that will enable them to be that authentic self, to be more confident in yourself in whatever cultural and work environment? Yeah. Right.
I really truly think it's important to spend time with yourself. to get to understand yourself in order to be your authentic self. And so understand your own strengths, your own skills, your passions. I always tell my students that if you do your research around your passion, it's not going to feel like work. And I think it's the same thing for that person as they go into leadership. What are your values? What are your beliefs? What's important to you? And if you go into organizations that don't match with your values, then you need to be ready to leave that organization, because then you're not leading from your authentic self. And so we encourage folks to think about, what am I willing to not give up as a leader? And I think that helps to find your path down that authentic leadership path. But I think we need to learn to do some mentoring, do some coaching, and do some understanding of who we are and what we want to, how we want to. I want to leave the world in that old cliche, better than it was, and that is important. I want to make an impact, and I'm not saying that I need people to say, "Oh, I remember when Barb did," but for myself, I want to know that I made an impact. I don't want it for the fame and the glam. I want to know that what I did, even if it was a small thing, made an impact, and you'll feel that. Personally, when you're leading from that authentic self.
Talk to me a little bit about being a Christian and your spiritual, like when we talk about spirituality and leadership and leading from that space, from that worldview, that lens.
Well, I think it's important for people to, and I know that the folks who are listening and others understand the difference between spirituality and religion, right? And so I'm a spiritual person, and some of my behaviors and my actions and how I present myself. And I hope that when people see me, that I reflect that spirituality. And what I mean is that calming, that peacefulness, that taking that minute and just being and enjoying all that is natural. I remember we used to have our walks, and sometimes our walks would be in silence for a period of time. And that's that time to be reflective and to have that sense of spirituality. And then in terms of religion, as a Christian, I do practice organized religion, and some of that religion is going to church and hearing the prayers and hearing the music. And I'm often moved by the music, both from a religious perspective, but from a spiritual perspective. When you really get connected to that song or to an emotional feeling that happens in that time. And so in my space, like I pray in the morning, I pray at night, I pray during the day. So when you talk about going to mass, whenever something is getting tough for me, I take that time to ask for help. And that help can be from God, but it can also be from the spiritual presence of my parents, the spiritual presence of my ancestors. When I did my PhD defense, and I did what's called typically a libations, and that's not religious, that would be spiritual. And my cousin Wayne came and did it, and we poured libations for those whose lives have lost. We poured libations for those who are yet to come. We poured libations for those who are here. And we called for the presence, the common presence, to be in that space. And I remember when I was telling my the coordinators of my PhD defense I was going to do libations, and they literally said, if you want to do a religious ceremony, you need to do that at the religious center. And I said, this isn't a religious this isn't a religious ceremony. It's to cleanse the room and to prepare myself for my defense. But I had to defend me wanting to have that peacefulness, that calmness around me. And so I try to bring that into the work that I do when there's chaos. And there's always chaos in leadership. And I think if I lead from a spiritual, from a lens of spirituality and a lens of Christianity, it helps. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you absolutely did, right? And it's so true. But the key thing that you said, where there's leadership, there's always chaos, right? And as a however we define the strength of a leader, right, is to guide their people, their culture through those times of chaos, and
listen, like really listen,
right? And
like I think the work that I do is I listen with my heart, and that's different, right?
Yeah, that's leading from the heart. A good friend of mine, what you reminded me of, who is now like the mother head superior of a convent that she founded, who used to work at Dalhousie years ago.
Oh, wow.
At the management school, had a big director job there years ago. Beautiful friend. She always said, when you take away the emotion, right? When something's gone, you take away the emotion, what you're left with is the truth, right? That's all that you're left with. And so in so many times and in so many work environments, it gets chaotic, it gets frenzied, and you get things in there, like you said, cleansing the space, where, I always think, they know not what they do. If they knew that.
Yeah.
I always say this to my friends, and this is my real Christian. I'm not trying to push Christianity, but it is who I am. And so sometimes it seeps out. But I always say to my children and my family, when Jesus looked down from the cross, he looked and said, like, imagine the compassion. They know not what they do. And I've taken that into my leadership approach, because it's about, if you actually woke up that day, do you think they woke up that day and thought, I want to be an ASSHOL? I want to hurt them. They don't. I don't believe inherently that, we do, or we want to, or that people do, but stuff gets in the way, right?
And it also goes back to who's the one teaching the leaders, right? And I guess that's why I like my first year students, because I want them to see a different way of developing skills, a different way of leading. And I think that does have an impact when we're also teaching other ways to look at the world, other ways to behave in the world, and challenging them as they become leaders or whatever path they go, to think about one thing that they could do differently. As they begin to influence and mentor other people's lives. Right. And I think that's important. A good therapist has a therapist. And the same way as a good leader has a good leader that mentored them. And that they go back to that leader when they're feeling lost from the path. And so as I was sitting reflecting, I was thinking about how much we supported each other during some tough times, in our career, as we were becoming new leaders or junior leaders, or whatever language they want to attach to people as they're developing leadership skills, which is also, quite interesting when different labels get attached. We're having a great
I had
time.
that turned off. Sorry if anybody heard that. Well, there we go, right? Maybe that's our timer. That time is that, our time is up.
It's also you being your authentic self, right? Like
I know.
one of my slogans that I have for students is life happens. And that's the other thing that makes them realize that I'm also human. And there might be times when I'm going through my own crises that I may have to say to my students, I need a minute. Right. Because no one is perfect. No, exactly. Except for, our Holy Father, our Heavenly Father. But sometimes we have to also let students see that humanistic side of us, that we all still struggle in different ways. Yeah. So that's important.
I think, I was thinking of, back in the day as well, that whole culture of not being able to make mistakes, to be who you are, to grow. You would think universities would be the perfect kind of, right? But in so many ways, you still have a culture that you're trying to conform to. And so the biggest challenge for me has been to forge that pathway, right? And to forge ahead, and to know when things go wrong, and to have that intuition, and to know when you need to pick up the phone and say, can you meet me across campus? Right.
Exactly. And
how far are you from the library?
Right. And I hope that in the positions that I'm in the leadership that I'm providing, that I'm being intentional on making it everybody's problem when things aren't going well. So that I have a variety of people on my committees, like I said, that are faculty, staff, senior leaders, so that there's buy-in, right? Like I don't think that there's enough buy-in from enough folks around what makes a good institution. And it's not just the senior managers or the senior leaders that makes a good institution. So we do need to take a good job of taking care of our students, our faculty, and our staff. Because the whole idea about leadership, of course, that there has to be also followers, right? And so I know that there's an old proverb that sometimes people are self-appointed leaders, and if there's no one's following them, they're just taking a long walk. And so we need to make sure that we have people that believe in what we're doing as well, and taking that time to check ourselves. I always tell folks that if I keep moving up the ladder, or whatever that analogy is, as a leader, and if I forget where I came from, then remind me.
Yeah.
Because one thing I never want to forget, no matter what position I am, is from whence I started.
Yeah.
And I started in the community of Beechville and Cherrybrook, 2 small African Nova Scotian communities. And those communities are what raised me. And if I don't ever acknowledge those 2 communities and the work that my communities did in raising me, then I have no right to be in those positions of leadership. None.
It's just such an awesome perspective. And I don't mean to say perspective by diminishing perspective, but you know what I mean? But imagine if everyone who walked onto campus or walked into every work environment had that perspective every day, right? And you think of, and that's why I think it's so important for leaders, especially, like I always say, and I probably have repeated it here on this podcast, but it's, for me, it's not about going to another leadership course or putting on another leadership course. It's about, we say one leader at a time, right? Developing one, I say principled leader at a time. There's my commercial. But it really is, right? But it really is about going through that process, because you can go to 1,000 million courses, but it might not make you better. It might give you better leadership methodologies and great understanding of environments. But until you know who you are and who you want to be, right? Those values, those beliefs, what makes you authentic, what makes you, interact and behave with integrity, accountability, responsibility, but being true to self, right? I think I don't know if I've said this to you, but my research, my committee, when I was going through candidacy, one of them asked me, well, can you be authentic and be an asshole? And I'm like, oh, and usually I would spell out asshole, ASS, but right. But it's, you absolutely can be, right?
Because that might be who you are.
Because that might be who you are. And when I do presentation, I like using the Archie Bunker thing, right? I think I say that
right.
But right, it's like he was as authentic as he came, right? He didn't think there was anything wrong.
And sometimes you rather know what you're dealing with than what you're not.
Right. And that's it. And that's the honest piece, right? And that's where you have that's the beginning of dialogue and conversation, isn't it? Yeah. I miss you. I miss our chats.
Well, this has been a great chat.
This has been fantastic. This is part A. We need to do this again, right?
I know we do.
I know.
We do.
Thank you.
I'm glad you took the time and that you didn't give up on calling me, and I could be part of this with you and being a part of our leadership journey together. And it's going to be interesting to see where we're going to be in, I don't know, 30, 20 years. And
I know.
I'm glad that New Zealand is treating you well. They got a gem in you. And I don't know how long you're going to stay there, but Nova Scotia can always use you back.
I don't, thank you. I know. I will keep that in mind. I don't know. Oh, I miss. Yeah, this is what I miss the most, right?
Yeah.
These awesome connections. And I keep, I don't know, maybe nobody will listen. Maybe you will. Thank you if you are. But it's really about, I keep saying this is my classroom. I live in a remote part of the world. And so I just thank you for taking the time to share your gems, who you are, your amazing, beautiful spirit, beautifulness. I love you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And so till next time. Thank you. All righty.
All right. We'll see you.
Thanks, Barb, for sharing your leadership insights. Your genuine, authentic, and courageous approach provide a calm and connectedness. I'm feeling a bit selfish, however, though, as it may have been super therapeutic for me. Join us next week when Father James Mallon joins us. We like to call him Father Bon Jovi. Tune in and you'll find out why.